One man started a war that should never have happened. He fabricated evidence. He manipulated a council. He unleashed an invasion the galaxy had no idea was coming. And when it was over, when his empire had collapsed, and his armies had been destroyed, and everything he built had turned to ash, the consequences of what he had done kept moving. They moved through centuries. They moved through people who had never heard his name. They moved through every Sith Lord, every dark side war, every near extinction of the Jedi that came after him, carrying the shape of the door he had kicked open whether anyone understood it or not. That is the difference between a Sith Lord who causes destruction and a Sith Lord who shapes the galaxy. Most Sith cause destruction. A handful of them change the structure of the future itself. And the most terrifying thing about that handful is this: most of them failed. Most of them died without achieving what they were after. Most of them were defeated, sometimes completely, sometimes publicly, and none of it mattered because the consequences had already been set in motion. And consequences do not stop when the person who caused them stops. What follows is the story of the ones who bent the galaxy, not through victory, through something much harder to defend against, through consequence that outlasted everything. There is no clean place to begin, but there is a place that changed everything. And the man standing at the center of it had a plan that was about to collapse in the most catastrophic possible way, in a way that would echo for the next 5,000 years. His name was Naga Sadow, and the galaxy that exists after him is not the galaxy that existed before. Long before anyone had heard of Darth Bane, long before the Clone Wars and the fall of the Old Republic, long before the names Revan or Nihilus or Trier meant anything to the galaxy at large, there was an empire, a real one, not a shadow order hiding behind carefully maintained secrecy, not two figures operating in the darkness and waiting for their moment. An actual civilization, vast and proud and old, built entirely on the philosophy of the dark side. The Sith Empire stretched across a corner of the galaxy that most beings in the Republic did not know existed. It had its own culture, its own traditions, its own architecture and art and hierarchy. It had been standing for thousands of years by the time the story of Naga Sadow begins, and it believed itself permanent. The empire was not monolithic. It had its internal tensions, its competing factions, its ambitious lords who watched each other with the same careful suspicion that the dark side philosophy demanded. Power was the only real currency, and anyone who accumulated too much of it became a target for those who wanted to take it. The empire survived this constant internal pressure because the Dark Lords who sat at its summit were generally skilled enough to play their rivals against each other, channeling ambition into competition rather than outright war. For centuries, this system worked. The empire endured. It expanded slowly. It grew wealthy. And it stayed hidden from the Republic on the other side of the galaxy, a civilization that did not officially exist to the people who would have feared it most. Naga Sadow was born into this world. He was not a pure-blooded member of the Sith species. His lineage was mixed. Human and Sith intertwined across generations, which made him a target of suspicion among those who measured worth by bloodline. But Naga Sadow did not allow suspicion to slow him down. He had something that transcended bloodlines entirely. He had vision. He could look at the galaxy spread beyond the Empire's borders and see not a boundary, but an invitation. The Republic sat out there, enormous and wealthy, and entirely unaware it was being watched. And Naga Sado spent his formative years waiting for the moment when that would change, when opportunity would arrive in a form he could use. He did not have to wait as long as he might have expected. The reigning Dark Lord of the Sith was a being named Marka Ragnos, and Ragnos was genuinely exceptional in a way that even Sado had to acknowledge. He had ruled for over a century. He had maintained his position not through raw power alone, though he had that in abundance, but through a sophisticated understanding of how to manage ambitious subordinates. He played rivals against each other. He rewarded success without ever allowing the successful to become too powerful. He eliminated threats before they fully formed. For 100 years, the Empire had been stable under his hand, not comfortable, because the Sith do not produce comfortable empires, but stable, functional, lasting. Then Ragnos died, and everything that his century of careful management had held in check began, immediately, to move. The two most powerful lords left standing were Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh. They were, in almost every meaningful way, opposites. Kresh was a conservative. He believed the Empire's strength came from its isolation and its discipline. He was deeply suspicious of change, and even more deeply suspicious of expansion. The Republic was powerful, he argued. Engaging it was risk without guaranteed reward. The Empire had survived by staying hidden and building inward. That was the correct strategy, and he saw no reason to abandon it. Naga Sado believed this view was a death sentence dressed up as wisdom. He looked at the Empire and saw not a fortress to be maintained, but a spring that had been wound too tightly for too long. The dark side was not a philosophy designed for hiding. It was a philosophy designed for domination. And domination, by its very nature, required expansion. The Republic growing fat and soft on the other side of the galaxy was not a reason for caution. It was an argument for moving now, before the Republic grew any stronger and the Empire's advantage of surprise was lost. Their conflict over the throne was still unresolved when something happened that no one had planned for, and that no one on either side of the argument knew quite how to respond to. Two young Republic citizens stumbled into Sith space by accident. Their names were Gav and Jory Daragon. They were merchants, or something like merchants. People living on the edges of respectability and trying not to fall further. Their hyperdrive had malfunctioned during a desperate run from debt collectors, and the blind jump they made to escape had deposited their ship directly in the heart of Sith-controlled space. When their vessel dropped out of hyperspace and found itself surrounded by Sith patrol ships, Gav and Jory Daragon were almost certainly the most surprised people in the galaxy at that particular moment. The Sith Empire did not receive visitors. It had no diplomatic relationships with the Republic, no trade agreements, no official channels of any kind. As far as most beings in the Republic were concerned, the space beyond the farthest charted routes was empty or simply unknown. The possibility that an ancient empire built on dark side philosophy was sitting just beyond the edge of the map had not seriously entered Republic thinking in a very long time. The arrival of actual Republic citizens inside Sith borders was therefore unprecedented. And unprecedented moments are always the most dangerous, because no one knows the right response. The Sith Council debated what to do with the Daragons. The conservative argument was simple: kill them. The Republic could not be permitted to know where the Empire was, how large it had grown, what capabilities it possessed. executing two unlucky travelers was unfortunate but rational. Ludo Kresh made this case clearly and without apology. The Empire's security depended on secrecy. Anything that threatened that secrecy had to be eliminated. Naga Sadao saw the situation entirely differently. He looked at the Daragons and did not see a problem. He saw an instrument. He saw two Republic citizens who had arrived carrying, without knowing it, information about Republic space that the Sith Empire could use. He saw a pair of living proof points that the Republic was reachable, that hyperspace routes connecting their two civilizations existed and could be mapped. And he saw, most importantly, an opportunity to manufacture the exact situation he had been arguing for. A justification for war that even the most cautious voices on the Council would struggle to dismiss. What Sadao did next demonstrated the kind of mind he possessed. Working in secret, he arranged for the Daragons to escape from their imprisonment. He staged what appeared to be an outside attack on their holding facility, making it look like the Republic had sent a rescue operation to retrieve its people. He planted false evidence, suggesting that Gav and Jory were not lost travelers at all, but deliberate scouts, sent specifically to map Sith territory and report back to Republic military intelligence. And then, using his considerable mastery of Sith sorcery and illusion, he went before the Council and presented this fabricated evidence with all the conviction of someone who had uncovered a genuine conspiracy. The Republic, he argued, already knew where the Empire was. They were already preparing. The question was not whether to fight, but whether to fight on their terms or the Empire's. Whether to be surprised or to be the one who surprised. Ludo Kresh remained suspicious. He was not a fool, and something about Sadao's account struck him as too perfectly timed, too conveniently aligned with everything Sadao had already been arguing. But suspicion without proof is difficult to act on in a political environment. And Sadao had been thorough. The Council was divided, and when it came to a vote, Sadao had done enough behind-the-scenes work to tip the balance in his direction. He was named Dark Lord of the Sith, and the Great Hyperspace War began. Sadao launched his invasion through multiple fronts simultaneously. The hyperspace routes that the Daragons had carried unknowingly became the pathways for Sith fleets to pour into Republic space in several directions at once, striking before any coordinated defense could be assembled. The attack was designed to be overwhelming, and initially, it was. Republic worlds that had spent generations assuming the greatest threats they faced came from within known space, were suddenly dealing with warships unlike anything they had encountered, piloted by beings with dark side capabilities, that their military had no effective doctrine for addressing. Naga Sadao was at the center of all of it, directing the invasion from a special vessel called a Sith meditation sphere, an ancient piece of technology designed to amplify a Sith Lord's Force connection and allow them to project their will across vast distances. From inside this sphere, he orchestrated illusions on a massive scale. Phantom armies, giant force-conjured creatures that appeared solid until they vanished. Battle formations that seemed to multiply and surround enemy positions before dissolving. The psychological impact alone was significant. Republic commanders facing an enemy that could make the impossible appear real on the battlefield had difficulty making calm tactical decisions. But illusions, no matter how skilled the practitioner, have a fundamental weakness. They eventually dissolve. And when they do, the enemy that has been fighting shadows understands what they were looking at. Republic commanders were methodical. They were not fools. They studied the pattern of what Shadow was projecting, and they found the seams, the moments when the illusions faded and the reality underneath became visible, and they adjusted. The Republic pushed back. It pushed back harder than Shadow had planned for, and on a timeline shorter than his projections had allowed. The counterattack came from a direction Shadow had also underestimated. Ludo Kresh, who had never fully accepted Shadow's elevation to Dark Lord, and had spent the entire period of the invasion building his own power base back in Sith space, chose this moment of Republic resistance to strike. He attacked Shadow's forces directly in an act of open civil war. Sith warships, firing on Sith warships, while the Republic gathered itself for its own counterstrike. The Empire, Shadow, had tried to wield as a single weapon turned on itself at the worst possible moment. The collapse was swift and catastrophic. Republic forces drove the Sith invasion fleets back through the hyperspace routes they had come through and kept going. They pushed all the way into Sith space itself. They reached Korriban, the ancient homeworld, the place where centuries of Sith history and dark side energy and buried lords had accumulated into something that went beyond a simple planet. Korriban fell. Kresh was killed in the fighting. And Naga Shadow, the man who had launched this entire catastrophe in the name of imperial destiny, found himself fleeing into the darkness with a handful of surviving ships and a remnant of followers. The Republic did not pursue him far enough to find where he went. They were exhausted and damaged in their own right. And the territory beyond the hyperspace routes the Sith had used was unknown enough to make extended pursuit feel like additional risk rather than necessary completion. They stopped at the edge of the familiar and declared the war over. The Sith Empire was broken. Its homeworld was captured. Its Dark Lord had fled into the unknown. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because no one had the resources left for more. What they could not know, because they did not follow, was that the remnant Naga Shadow brought to Yavin 4 would persist, that the dark side rituals he performed there would soak into the moon and remain long after he was gone, that the moon itself would become a node of dark side energy with its own gravitational pull on force-sensitive beings across generations, and that the specific knowledge Shadow had carried, his Sith sorcery, his understanding of the dark side's deepest workings, would survive his death through the simple fact that he could not fully leave. He eventually found Yavin 4, a jungle moon far enough from any Republic patrol route to offer safety by distance alone. He brought his surviving followers with him. What remained of an empire he had done more than any other single being to destroy. And there, on that green and ancient moon, he performed rituals. He used the dark side in ways that went deeper than combat or illusion, binding his followers to him through sorcery so pervasive it functioned less like devotion and more like rewriting. The people he brought with him and the generations that descended from them, the beings history would call the Masasi, became something caught between servants and instruments, shaped entirely by the dark side will of a master who eventually stopped being able to direct them consciously because Naga Shadow died, or something like it. The dark side does not always permit its most devoted practitioners the clean exit of a simple death. His body gave out eventually, but his presence did not depart entirely. It lingered in the concentrated dark side energies of the moon itself, absorbed into the stone and the jungle and the Force signature of a place that had seen tremendous darkness and retained it. Yavin 4 remembered him. And the Massassi, in the strange and terrible way of beings, reshaped too completely by power that was not meant for them, continued to serve what remained of him long after any conscious direction had ceased. The damage Naga Sadow did to the galaxy was already complete long before any of this happened. The Great Hyperspace War reshaped the Republic's understanding of itself. It demonstrated that threats could exist outside the mapped boundaries of known space, which changed how the Republic thought about its borders and its military readiness for centuries afterward. It accelerated political developments that might otherwise have taken much longer. It left Korriban soaked in so much concentrated dark side energy, through the deaths of its defenders and the accumulated rituals of a civilization that had called it home, that the planet became something more than a world. It became a place where the dead seemed to breathe, where the Force whispered in registers that made even experienced Jedi uncomfortable, in ways they could not always explain, where the tombs of Sith Lords were not merely burial chambers, but repositories of power and intention and hunger that never fully faded. Korriban would draw Sith and dark side seekers to it for thousands of years. Every one of them arrived because the Great Hyperspace War had made it famous. Every one of them was shaped, to some degree, by what Naga Sadow had built and broken there. The hyperspace roots were the other legacy, the roots the Daragons had carried unknowingly into Sith space and that Sadow had used to launch his invasion. Those roots cut in both directions. They were now known. They had been traveled. And the knowledge of where the Sith had been, where they had built their temples and their tombs and their libraries of accumulated dark side understanding, that knowledge survived the war. It was recorded. It circulated. And knowledge of that kind does not stay in archives. It leaks. It travels. It finds its way to the people most motivated to follow it. Everything that came after walked through the door Naga Sadow had kicked open. Every scholar who followed those routes toward Korriban, every Jedi who heard rumors of what lay in those ancient tombs and felt the pull of curiosity sharpen into something they could not quite name, every dark side practitioner who found their way to a Sith artifact because the war had spread those artifacts across the galaxy in the chaos of defeat. Naga Sadow did not conquer the Republic. He failed at everything he set out to accomplish. His empire collapsed. His armies were destroyed. His political rivals were proven right in the most expensive possible way, but he broke something open. And consequence, in the long run, outlasts conquest. Victory can be undone. Borders can be rolled back. Armies can be defeated. But the world that exists after a door has been broken is not the world that existed before. Naga Sadow opened a door between the Republic and the Sith that had previously been sealed. And nothing that came after, nothing, would have been the same without it. Some falls happen gradually, layer by layer, choice by choice. The light fades until the person who remains looks nothing like the person who began. But Freeden Nad's fall was not that kind. It was swift. It was deliberate. And it was, in its own way, completely inevitable, given the particular combination of gifts and hungers that had defined him since he was a student. He had been a Jedi, a promising one. His masters recognized in him a rare alignment of natural force sensitivity and relentless intellectual drive that made him stand apart even in a generation full of capable students. He could have become a great Jedi Knight. He had every ingredient required. The raw ability was extraordinary. The discipline, when he chose to apply it, was formidable. The dedication to understanding the Force was genuine and deep. What he could not accept was the pace of it. The deliberate, measured unfolding of Jedi training, the way knowledge was parceled out slowly, not because there was any lack of it, but because the Order believed that certain understandings had to be earned at specific stages, that the wrong knowledge given to an unprepared mind was more dangerous than no knowledge at all. Freedon Nad was not prepared to accept anyone else's assessment of what his mind was ready for. He had looked at his own potential and concluded that the limitations placed on him applied to lesser students, not to him. He sought more. He asked questions his masters were not comfortable answering. He followed references in restricted text to their source materials and then argued that restricting source materials was arbitrary gatekeeping rather than legitimate wisdom. He pushed and tested and eventually made clear by the accumulation of these actions that he was not interested in the patient path the Order offered him. He was interested in the destination. And the Order could not give him the destination on the timeline he had decided was appropriate, so he went looking for it somewhere else. What he found, eventually, was the moon of Yavin 4. By the time Nad arrived there, the moon was already saturated with concentrated dark side energy. Naga Sado's rituals had soaked into the soil and the stone of the place. The Massassi still lived there in their strange, diminished way, serving a master whose capacity for conscious direction had long since faded. And the remnant of Naga Sado himself, that persistent whisper of presence that the dark side had declined to fully release, was there too, waiting in the way that only the dead can wait, without impatience, without discomfort, with only the sustained hunger of something that wants to continue influencing a world it can no longer fully inhabit. Naga Sado recognized Freedon Nad immediately. He saw in this fallen Jedi exactly the combination he had been waiting generations to encounter. The raw Force sensitivity was extraordinary. The ambition was genuine and complete, untempered by any of the caution that made most Force users slow. And the willingness to go anywhere and pay any price to obtain power was precisely what Sado's remaining presence needed in a living vessel. They made an exchange. It was not equal. Exchanges between the dead and the living never are, because the dead have nothing to lose from the transaction, and the living rarely understand the full cost until it has already been paid. Nad received what he came for. The dark side knowledge Sado had spent a lifetime accumulating. The Sith sorcery that the ancient Lord had refined. The philosophical framework that had once animated an empire. And something else, harder to name. An orientation, a way of perceiving the Force that, once adopted, cannot be easily shed. An understanding that the dark side is not a tool that sits beside you, but a tide that moves through you and leaves something behind each time. Freedon Nad left Yavin 4 transformed, in the truest and most complete sense of that word. He eventually came to Onderon. It was a world that had been shaped by its own specific kind of harshness. The planet's surface was dominated by massive beasts, creatures that had spent so many generations competing in an environment of extraordinary difficulty that they had become something genuinely dangerous. The people of Onderon had survived by building walls. High, thick walls around their cities that kept the wilderness at a safe distance and allowed human civilization to persist inside its own defined perimeter. They were, in every sense, a people who understood that the world outside their control could destroy them. They had built their entire way of life around that understanding. Nad walked through their walls as though they were not there. He conquered Onderon not through the slow accumulation of military advantage, but through the overwhelming and immediate demonstration of power that made organized resistance feel not merely futile but somehow absurd. He used the dark side in ways the people of Onderon had never encountered and had no framework for understanding. He became their king. And then he became something more than that. He became the defining fact of their civilization while he was still alive, which is the most effective form of dominance because it eliminates the distinction between a ruler and a natural force. You do not rebel against weather. You do not organize opposition to gravity. And for the people of Onderon, Freedon Nad became indistinguishable from those categories of inevitable reality. He ruled for 100 years. Through Sith, alchemy, and dark side techniques learned from Nagasado and pushed further in the direction his own particular genius drove him, he extended his life well beyond its natural limit. He built, he studied, he refined. He turned Onderon into a laboratory for dark side governance and left his mark on the world at every level, from its politics to its religion, to the architecture of its cities and the fears of its people. The culture he built on Onderon was not merely political. It was total. The dark side was not presented as an option or a philosophy that existed alongside others. It was the foundation of everything, the way the world understood itself. Children grew up in a civilization that had been specifically shaped at every level to make the dark side seem not only natural but necessary. The beasts outside the walls were not just a practical threat, they were a philosophical teaching. Strength protects, weakness is consumed. The dark side is not cruelty. The dark side is honesty about what the galaxy actually is. Nad understood that the most durable form of control is not the kind that has to be enforced from outside. It is the kind that lives inside the minds of the controlled, so thoroughly embedded that they cannot imagine thinking differently. He was not simply ruling Onderon. He was rebuilding it from the inside out, so that even after he was gone, the world would continue to function according to his design, because his design had become the world's understanding of itself. When he finally died, as he had to eventually even with all his extensions and delays, he had been king of Onderon for so long that the world without him was genuinely difficult to imagine. He did not leave it. His spirit anchored itself to the dark side artifacts he had created and to the tomb he had built for himself beneath the royal palace. He stayed in the way that Nagasado had stayed on Yavin 4, not fully present and not fully gone. He continued to influence events. He guided his descendants who ruled after him and carried his bloodline and his teachings together. He shaped the religious and political culture of Onderon from beyond death in ways that made the living question where his direct intervention ended and their own free will began. The Nadists, as his followers came to be called, worshipped him as a god-king and maintained his dark side traditions with the fervor of people who believe they are serving something that has not entirely departed. For centuries, this persisted. The Jedi knew about Onderon in a vague way, the same way you know about a distant irritation that has not yet required direct attention, but eventually the situation on the world became impossible to ignore. The conflict between those who embraced Nad's legacy inside the walls and those who had been cast out and learned to survive in the wilderness. The Beast Riders who had built their own culture in opposition to the city reached a scale that put it on the Republic's radar. The Jedi came to deal with it. They brought with them a group of younger knights and Padawans, including a talented young man named Ulic Qel-Droma, who would go on to matter in this story in ways he could not have imagined when he arrived on Onderon expecting a mission with a defined beginning, middle, and end. They confronted the dark side tradition Nad had built. They managed to suppress it at considerable effort and cost, and they believed, as the Jedi always believe in these moments, that they had succeeded, that what had been done was sufficient, that the problem, now addressed, would not persist. They were wrong in the specific way that people who have underestimated the staying power of the dark side are always wrong. Not immediately wrong. The immediate problem was genuinely resolved. Nad's spirit was weakened. His living followers were scattered or defeated. The most visible expressions of his influence were dismantled. But the accumulated dark side energy Nad had embedded in Onderon across a century of rulership and a further century of posthumous haunting does not simply evaporate because the immediate practitioners have been defeated. It soaks in, it persists, and it waits for the next person whose particular combination of gifts and hungers makes them a natural resonant point for what has been left behind. Before the Jedi could fully contain the situation, Nad made one final move. His spirit, sensing its suppression and the narrowing window it had remaining, sought out two young visitors who had come to Onderon looking for exactly the kind of power Nad had accumulated. Satal and Alima Keto were aristocrats from a wealthy system. They were not force-sensitive in any powerful or trained sense, but they were ambitious and hungry for power of a kind that their privileged lives had not provided. And they had traveled specifically to find the dark side tradition they had heard rumors about. Nad recognized in them something useful. Not vessels for his own continuation, exactly, but carriers, messengers, people through whom the knowledge he had spent his life accumulating could be transmitted to people who would use it. He passed dark side teachings to the Keto siblings before his spirit was finally banished from Onderon. They escaped with ancient scrolls and Sith artifacts hidden among their belongings. They returned to their home system in the Empress Teta region. And what they did with what Nad had given them seeded one of the most destructive conflicts the galaxy had seen in centuries. Freedon Nad was dead. His spirit was gone. His century-long reign was over, and his posthumous haunting of Onderon had been brought to a close. He had, in every technical sense, been defeated. But the Keto siblings were already home, and the knowledge was already moving through the galaxy in a new form, wearing new faces, building towards something that Nad himself might not have fully anticipated but would certainly have recognized. The darkness he had accumulated does not stay in one place. It cannot be fully contained by defeating its current vessel. It finds the next one, and the next one was already reading ancient Sith scrolls in the Empress Teta system with the enthusiasm of people who have just discovered they have been given a key. There is a type of person who is so certain of their own exceptional nature that they mistake that certainty for wisdom. They are brilliant, usually. Their confidence is not entirely misplaced. They genuinely can do things that others cannot. They learn faster and reach further and understand more deeply than the people around them, and they know it. And this knowledge becomes the lens through which they interpret everything else. Every limit placed on them is unfair. Every warning they receive is timidity. Every boundary is an obstacle built for lesser minds and applied to them by mistake. Exar Kun was exactly this kind of person. He came to the Jedi Order with gifts that surprised even his masters. His natural connection to the Force was profound. His ability to absorb training was almost unsettling in its speed. He could match practitioners who had been working at their craft for decades. He could defeat fellow students without appearing to exert any real effort. He was, by every objective measure, remarkable, and he knew it. That knowing was the thing his masters watched with concern. That specific quality of self-awareness transformed not into humility, but into entitlement. His master was Vodo Siosk Bas, an ancient and perceptive being of tremendous wisdom. Bas had spent many decades producing gifted students. He recognized immediately what was forming in Exar Kun. He tried to address it directly, which is the right approach, and also frequently an ineffective one when applied to someone who has already decided that their judgment exceeds their teachers. He counseled patience. He redirected Kun's hunger toward appropriate channels. He warned specifically and personally about the dark side, not in vague philosophical terms, but in the direct language of someone who understood exactly which vulnerabilities in Kun made him susceptible. Kun heard these warnings and concluded that they applied to everyone else. He began investigating the dark side independently, carefully at first, within the boundaries the archives permitted, then less carefully, as he found that the boundaries the archives permitted were not the boundaries of what the archives contained. References to Sith texts, mentions of artifacts that had been recovered and sealed, accounts of fallen practitioners whose experiences had been recorded and then restricted. He followed these references the way a person follows a thread, and the thread led him somewhere specific. It led him to the name Freeden Nad, and from that name, through the chain of events that Nad had set in motion, to the moon of Dixun, in the Onderon system, where the sarcophagus of Freeden Nad had been relocated and sealed by Jedi who believed that physical containment would serve where spiritual containment had proven insufficient. Exar Kun arrived in the Onderon system still carrying his Jedi credentials, still technically a Padawan, still capable of telling himself that what he was doing was scholarship. He wanted access to knowledge. He was strong enough to handle it. The Jedi's reluctance to grant that access was a failure of vision on their part, not a legitimate caution on his. He had told himself this story so many times that it no longer felt like justification. It felt like fact. On DX Sun, surrounded by the concentrated dark side energy that Freeden Nad had left embedded in his burial site, Exar Kun made contact with what remained of that ancient practitioner's presence. Nad's spirit was different from Sado's remnant, more focused, more deliberate in its engagement with the living. It had spent decades guiding and shaping and influencing people who came seeking what it had. It recognized Exar Kun precisely and completely. It saw the raw power and the terrible certainty and the specific kind of ambition that would respond not to seduction, but to the straightforward presentation of a better deal. It showed him things, just enough things to make him want more. And then it told him where more could be found. Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld, the planet of tombs. A world that had been absorbing dark side energy for so long that the distinction between the Force, as it naturally existed there, and the deliberate workings of dead Sith Lords had become difficult to locate. Korriban was not simply a graveyard. It was a library in which the books were still alive with something, where the accumulated intentions of generations of dark side practitioners had soaked into every stone and every shadow, and where those intentions still exerted pressure on anyone Force-sensitive enough to perceive them. Exar Kun arrived there with his Force sensitivity blazing, and his defenses down in the specific way that certainty creates. Certainty is a particular kind of vulnerability. The person who believes they are prepared for something does not remain alert to the ways in which they might not be. The person who knows they are strong does not maintain the same guard as the person who is aware of their limitations. Exar Kun arrived on Korriban, believing he was in control of the encounter. He believed he had come to learn from what the Sith had left behind, not to be consumed by it. The Sith Lords in those tombs had been waiting for exactly this type of visitor. What happened to him on Korriban was not slow corruption. The dark side does not always move gradually. Sometimes it recognizes an opportunity and acts with decisive, overwhelming speed. The spirits and accumulated energies in those ancient burial chambers pressed into Kun all at once, not drip by drip but as a flood, and his physical body could not contain what was being forced through it. He was crushed under collapsing stone. He lay broken and dying in a place that had destroyed more capable people than him. And as he lay there, he had to contend with what he had actually brought himself to. Freeden Nad's spirit came to him in that moment. It made him an offer. Accept the dark side completely. Stop fighting it. Stop trying to hold it at arm's length while accessing its knowledge, because that is not how the dark side functions. Let it in without reservation, and it would heal him. It would do more than heal him. It would transform him into something commensurate with the ambition he had always believed himself capable of. Exar Kun made his choice, and in making it, he stopped being a fallen Jedi in the gradual sense and became something the galaxy had not encountered in a long time. Not a practitioner of the dark side who maintained some distance from what they were doing. Not someone who told themselves mitigating stories about scholarship and understanding. A Sith Lord, fully. In the way that the title was originally meant, he healed. He rose, and then he did something characteristic. He turned on Freeden Nad's spirit and destroyed it. It was the latest expression of the oldest Sith pattern. The apprentice who absorbs everything the master has to give and then eliminates the master. Naga Sado had fallen to it. Freeden Nad himself had perpetuated it. And now, Exar Kun completed the cycle again, with the same efficiency that he applied to everything else. He did not need Nad anymore. He had taken what Nad possessed, and the spirit of a dead Sith Lord was a potential rival now, not a resource. He declared himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith, and he began to build. What he built was the Brotherhood of the Sith. This was not Sado's conception of empire, not a geographic and political civilization with its own territory and population. Exar Kun was building something more targeted. A network of Force users gathered from across the galaxy, organized around the philosophy of the dark side and directed against specific enemies. He reached out to dissatisfied Jedi, to students who had felt the pull of the dark side and been struggling against it, to Force users who had never received formal training but had enough sensitivity to respond to what he was offering. He pulled them toward him, using the combination of his genuine power and his absolute certainty, which is a compelling combination to people who are uncertain and searching. The Brotherhood was not built on fear in the simple sense. Exar Kun was too intelligent for simple fear. He understood that the most effective way to gather Force users to a cause was to make them believe the cause was theirs. He listened. He found the specific grievance each person carried, the specific way in which the Jedi Order or the Republic had failed them, or constrained them, or dismissed them, and he made clear that he understood those grievances in a way no one else had bothered to. He was offering not just power, but validation. The sense that the limitations they had been told to accept were not actually necessary. That someone of his capability had looked at them and seen what they were actually capable of and was willing to say it plainly. Among those he pulled toward him was Ulic Qel-Droma. Ulic had been part of the Jedi delegation sent to Onderon. He had faced the dark side there and had come back carrying something his fellow Jedi could see, but could not quite name. Not the dark side itself, exactly, but the mark of having been in very close proximity to it for an extended period while under significant stress. He had gone to Onderon, a confident and capable young Jedi Knight. He had come back something more complicated. The mission had not broken him, but it had bent certain internal structures that had previously been straight. In the aftermath of Onderon, he undertook a mission to infiltrate the Krath, the dark side organization that the Keto siblings had built from what Freedon Nad had given them. It was a deliberate plan, approved at some levels of the Order and opposed at others. The intent was to gather intelligence from inside, to understand the Krath's capabilities, and plans well enough to counter them effectively. It was the kind of mission that requires extraordinary internal stability to survive, because it involves immersion in the dark side. In contexts where maintaining the distinction between performance and reality is a continuous and exhausting effort, the plan failed. Not immediately and not completely, but in the way that matters most. Sith poison, administered by the Krath, clouded his judgment. Alima Keto, who was both intelligent and deliberately seductive, worked on him systematically. Between the physical manipulation of the toxin and the sustained psychological campaign directed at his specific vulnerabilities, the line between the role he was playing and the state he was actually in began to blur. And once that line blurs enough, it is very difficult to locate again from the inside. Ulic Qel-Droma fell to the dark side, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small degradations and adjustments and rationalizations that eventually amounted to the same thing. By the time Exar Kun found him, he was not performing darkness anymore. He was in it. And Kun, with the precision of someone who has examined his own fall with analytical attention, recognized exactly where Ulic was and what he needed to hear. They fought when they first met, as the Sith tradition demanded, testing each other, establishing relative strength. And then the ancient Sith spirits who had been waiting for exactly this alignment appeared to them together and declared what Kun had already intuited. They were meant to work together, master and apprentice, the two halves of the new Sith Order that would do what Naga Sadow's invasion had failed to accomplish. Exar Kun took Ulic as his Sith apprentice and marked him physically, as the old tradition demanded. And together they launched what history would record as the Great Sith War. The Krath forces that Alima Keto commanded joined the Brotherhood. The Mandalorian warriors, that culture of conquerors who had fought alongside the Sith before and found the arrangement productive, joined through their leader Mandalore the Indomitable. The combined force that Exar Kun assembled was substantial. More importantly, it was directed by someone who understood the Jedi Order from the inside and knew exactly where its vulnerabilities lay. He exploited those vulnerabilities with precision that could only come from that inside knowledge. He raided Ossus, the great Jedi library world, extracting knowledge that had been accumulated across thousands of years. He went to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and did something that had not been done before and would not be done again for a very long time. He walked into the heart of the Jedi Order and spoke directly to the assembled young students there. He was persuasive in the way that someone who has lived the argument is always more persuasive than someone merely making it. He talked about what the Jedi were hiding, about what they were afraid to teach, about the knowledge that existed beyond the comfortable limits they imposed on their students. Some of the young Jedi he spoke to resisted. Those he killed. Those who followed him returned to their masters and murdered them in their sleep. The Jedi Order had never faced a threat quite like this one. Wars were one thing. Military campaigns could be met with military responses. But a wave of corruption that moved through your own students, that turned the people you had trained and trusted into instruments of the enemy, required a different kind of response for which the Order was not fully prepared. Each Jedi Master killed by a former student was not just a casualty. It was a specific erasure, a line of teaching and wisdom and accumulated understanding that stopped at that moment and could not be recovered. The knowledge those masters carried died with them. The students they would have trained were never trained. The ripple effects of those individual deaths extended far beyond the deaths themselves into a future that was subtly diminished in ways no one could fully measure. At the height of his power, Exar Kun demonstrated that there was no limit he would not cross in the pursuit of his objectives. He entered the Republic Senate in session and used Sith sorcery to assassinate the Supreme Chancellor in full view of the assembled representatives. The act was calculated to produce maximum chaos at a moment when the Republic needed clarity most, and it succeeded. The political disorganization that followed bought him time and space that a more coherent government response would have foreclosed. For a period, it genuinely seemed possible that Exar Kun would succeed where every previous Sith effort had failed. The Republic was staggering. The Jedi Order was bleeding from within. The Brotherhood was coordinated and purposeful, and led by someone with the intelligence to make use of every advantage his position gave him. The fracture came from an unexpected direction, and it came because of Ulic Qel-Droma on Ossus. As the Jedi were attempting to evacuate what they could of their ancient library before Sith tactics destroyed the world, Ulic encountered his brother Kay in direct combat. Kay had not come to fight. He had come to reach his brother, to find, inside the darkness, the person who had existed before it. He fought only because Ulic gave him no choice. And in a moment of passion and fury and whatever terrible combination of pain and lost clarity produces the irreversible act, Ulic struck his brother down. The moment his brother died, something cleared in Ulic Qel-Droma. Not completely, not in a way that restored him to what he had been, but enough. Enough for a Jedi Knight named Nomi Sunrider, who possessed a rare and extraordinary ability to sever a Force user's connection to the Force itself, to act. She reached into Ulic's connection and cut it. The Force that had flowed through him since childhood went silent, and Ulic Qel-Droma, Dark Lord, Sith apprentice, architect of the war that had cost the Republic billions of lives, was left standing in the ruins of what he had done with no way to access any of the power that had defined him. He surrendered. He gave up Exar Kun's location, and the Republic forces moved on Yavin 4 with a full military fleet. Exar Kun knew what was coming, and he understood that the conventional end of this story would be his physical defeat and death. He was not willing to accept that ending. He had spent his life refusing to accept limits that others imposed on him. And death was not exempt from that refusal simply because it was death. He gathered the Massassi on Yavin 4 and performed a ritual of tremendous and terrible dark side power. He channeled their life force, the life force of every member of an entire people, to accomplish what no amount of conventional dark side practice could produce. He separated his spirit from his body. He stored himself in the temples and the stone and the dark side energy of the moon itself, the same energy that had been building there since Naga Sado had performed his own desperate rituals in the aftermath of his own catastrophic failure. The Jedi fleet arrived. Nomi Sunrider led the Order's Force users in creating what they called a wall of light, a combined expenditure of Force energy directed at containing and neutralizing what Exar Kun had produced. The collision of light and dark side energies across the surface of Yavin 4 was catastrophic in its own specific way. The Massassi were already gone. Now, the moon itself was scorched. The temples stood, but the spirit that had retreated into them was trapped rather than destroyed. Neither alive nor dead, neither present nor fully absent. The Jedi believed they had won. They had won, in the sense that the great Sith war was over. The Brotherhood of the Sith was finished. The immediate threat was neutralized. But Exar Kun was not destroyed. He was waiting. The cost of what he had done was enormous and would take generations to fully absorb. Planets had been devastated. The Jedi Order had been hollowed out from within in ways that left structural weaknesses that took decades to identify and address. The Great Library at Ossus, one of the most significant accumulations of knowledge in the galaxy, had been burned and buried under the light of a dying star, with only a fraction of what it had contained successfully evacuated in time. Entire lineages of Jedi Masters and their particular understandings of the Force were simply gone, and with them the specific teachings and insights that could not be recovered because the people who carried them were dead. The galaxy that existed after the Great Sith War was not the galaxy that existed before it. It was more scarred, more suspicious, more aware that the greatest threats to the Republic could come not from outside the Jedi Order but from within it. The lesson Exar Kun taught was one that the Order would struggle to apply correctly for generations because the correct application of it required a level of honesty about internal vulnerability that institutions rarely manage when they are also trying to project stability and authority. Thousands of years later, a man named Luke Skywalker would build a school for Jedi on Yavin 4. He would choose it for its history and its strong connection to the Force. He would not know, or not know fully enough, about the specific nature of the dark side presence embedded in the ancient stone of that moon. One of his students, a young man named Kip Duron, who had suffered more than any young person should, and had the specific combination of pain and raw power that made him exactly the kind of vessel a trapped spirit would recognize, would find something in the Force, something that whispered to him from the ruins, something patient and hungry and absolutely certain of its own exceptional nature. Exar Kun waited a very long time. The dark side is patient with those it has claimed, and the ancient Lord had nowhere else to be. Three figures from ages separated by centuries. One who tore open the galaxy's borders and set in motion a chain of consequences that echoed for millennia. One who refused to leave after death and kept teaching long past the point where his living students had forgotten who had taught them. One who burned through everything he touched with the certainty that his own power was reason enough to proceed. Three versions of the same fundamental truth: that the dark side does not require victory to change the galaxy. It only requires presence. And presence, if it burns hot enough, leaves marks that no amount of time or light side counterforce can fully erase. The next figures in this story understood that truth and used it deliberately. What comes next is darker and, in its own way, more permanent. The most dangerous idea in Sith history was not a weapon. It was not a ritual, not a technique, not an artifact that could be locked away and contained. It was a thought, a single, clear, devastating insight that one man arrived at by looking honestly at the wreckage his order had made of itself across thousands of years, and drawing the conclusion that everyone else had been too proud or too invested to draw. The Sith had never failed because of the Jedi. They had failed because of themselves. That was the thought. And the man who thought it clearly enough to act on it, completely enough to reshape everything that came after, was Darth Bane. Before any of that, though, there was a person, a young man who grew up in the cortosis mines of Apatros, doing brutal physical work in conditions that were designed by the economics of debt labor to ensure that no one who entered them ever escaped. He was born into a system structured to consume people, and he watched it consume everyone around him. And he survived it not through luck or rescue, but through the specific kind of hardness that forms in people the world treats as expendable from the beginning. He had a name before. He was Darth Bane. The name does not matter for this story. What matters is that the person who would eventually redesign the Sith Order from first principles began his life in a hole in the ground, learning something about power and powerlessness, and the specific cruelty of systems designed to maintain themselves at the expense of the people inside them. He carried that education with him into everything that came after. He found the dark side, not as a philosophical choice, but as a survival mechanism. The Force responded to his anger and his desperation and the enormous pressure of a life spent being crushed, and it gave him tools he had not previously had. He eventually escaped the mines. He found his way to the Brotherhood of Darkness, and there, for the first time, he was surrounded by people who possessed the same basic nature he did, who felt the dark side, the way he felt it, who understood the philosophy of power and desire and will that had always seemed obvious to him, but that the people around him in the mines had not shared. He should have felt at home, and for a while, perhaps he did, but then he started reading. He found the archives. He found the records of every Sith effort across thousands of years. He found the patterns. The Brotherhood of Darkness was, by any standard measure, an impressive organization. Lord Khan had assembled under its banner nearly every Sith Lord operating in the galaxy. Hundreds of dark side practitioners, trained and experienced and coordinated under a single command structure. It was everything the old Sith empires had aspired to. Numbers, unity, direction, a genuine force that had brought the Republic to a point of real crisis and pushed the Jedi Order into a defensive posture unlike anything the Guardians of the Light had faced in generations. And Darth Bane, standing inside it, watching it operate, understood with complete and cold certainty that it was going to fail. He had read the history, all of it. The Great Hyperspace War, which Naga Sado had launched and lost through precisely this kind of overextension and internal fracture. The campaigns of Exar Kun, which had come so close and then collapsed the moment Ulic Cheldroma killed his brother, and something in the grand edifice cracked. The endless cycles of Sith empires and brotherhoods and orders that rose, achieved real momentum, and then tore themselves apart from the inside. Because the dark side philosophy that made the Sith powerful was the same philosophy that made sustained cooperation between them effectively impossible. The dark side rewards ambition. It feeds on desire. It cultivates the drive to be more powerful, more dominant, more in control than everyone around you. These qualities are the source of Sith strength. They are also, and this is what Bane understood so clearly, it must have felt like a physical thing, incompatible with the existence of a large organization. You cannot have 100 dark side practitioners in the same room and expect them to cooperate indefinitely. Every one of them is driven by the imperative to rise. Every one of them views every other one as a potential obstacle. Every alliance is temporary. Every arrangement of mutual benefit is a delay between the moment it becomes useful and the moment it becomes a liability. The Brotherhood of Darkness was 100 ambitious dark side practitioners in the same room, with a unified enemy to fight and a charismatic leader to follow. And Bane could see exactly how it was going to end. Khan preached equality among Sith Lords. He called them all equal members of the Brotherhood, eliminated the traditional hierarchy of master above apprentice, positioned himself as first among peers rather than as a Dark Lord in the old sense. He believed this was progressive. He believed it resolved the succession problem that had undone so many previous Sith leaders by removing the question of succession entirely. If everyone was equal, no one needed to kill the one above them to advance. Bane thought this was the most catastrophically wrong interpretation of Sith philosophy imaginable. Equality did not eliminate ambition. It simply made ambition undirected. When there was no legitimate hierarchy to climb, ambitious Sith did not stop being ambitious. They formed factions. They made deals. They positioned themselves for the moment when the equality Khan was preaching would inevitably give way to the older and more honest reality of dominance and submission. The Brotherhood was not a solution to Sith infighting. It was a greenhouse for it. The conditions were perfect. All you needed was the right stress, and it would all come apart at once. Bane engineered that stress deliberately. He was not merely watching the Brotherhood fail, he was accelerating the failure. He had come to the conclusion, through his study of ancient Sith texts and his unflinching analysis of everything the Order had done wrong, that the Brotherhood needed to die. Not to be reformed or reorganized or led differently, to die completely so that something better could replace it. And he was willing to be the instrument of that death, even while standing inside the organization, even while its members believed him one of their own. He found the thought bomb, or rather, he found the records of it, and brought them to Khan's attention at precisely the moment when Khan was desperate enough to reach for anything. The thought bomb was an ancient Sith weapon of tremendous and specific destructive power. It required the combined force energy of every Sith present to create. It would destroy every force-sensitive being within its blast radius, and it would trap their souls in permanent suffering, in a state that was neither life nor death, but something worse than either. What Bane told Khan was that it was the Brotherhood's last hope for victory. What Bane knew was that it was the Brotherhood's end. Every Sith Lord who participated in creating the weapon would be destroyed by it. The Jedi who rushed in to face them would be destroyed, and Bane would be elsewhere. He had arranged it. He would be the only Sith Lord who survived the Battle of Ruusan, because he was the only one who understood what the battle was actually for. The thought bomb detonated. Nearly 100 Sith Lords and a large portion of the Jedi who had come to stop them were gone in an instant. Their spirits sealed into the cave system beneath Ruusan's surface in the manner Bane had anticipated. The armies above saw the light fade and the fighting stop and assumed that both sides had destroyed each other. The Republic declared victory. The Jedi Order mourned its losses and accepted the conclusion that the ancient war between Jedi and Sith had finally, definitively ended. Darth Bane walked out of the smoke, carrying the most comprehensive collection of Sith knowledge he had been able to gather, and the clearest possible version of the plan he had spent years developing. The Sith would continue, but they would continue differently. Differently enough that the failure mode that had ended every previous iteration would not apply. He thought about what that required. He went back to the fundamental principle, the insight that had started everything. The Sith failed because of themselves, because their numbers created competition that created infighting that created the collapse of every large-scale Sith effort. At the exact moment when those efforts were closest to success. Reduce the numbers far enough and you change the equation entirely. You eliminate the internal competition problem by removing the competition. You create instead a relationship of concentration, where everything the Sith know and are is invested in two people, who between them carry the total accumulated weight of the tradition and direct it outward as a unified thing, without internal fracture, without competing agendas, without the inevitable betrayal of alliance that larger numbers always produce. 2. Sith, a master to embody power, and an apprentice to crave it. The master would train the apprentice in everything, not parceled out, not held back strategically the way a paranoid ruler hoards advantages. Everything, because the system required the apprentice to eventually be strong enough to kill the master, and an apprentice who had not been given everything could not reliably become that strong. The apprentice would absorb the master's complete knowledge, add their own discoveries and insights to it, become something that exceeded the master. And then, when they were ready, they would prove it by ending the master and becoming the next link in the chain, not a betrayal, a completion. The system functioning as designed, refining itself through the most direct possible test of whether the successor had genuinely surpassed what came before. This was the rule of two. It was not, when Bane first articulated it fully, an obviously successful system. It had obvious vulnerabilities. If a master was killed before their apprentice was ready, the line ended. If an apprentice was too weak to ever succeed, the line stagnated. If the master was so strong they never found an apprentice capable of the required growth. The same result. The system had no redundancy. It was a single thread, and a single thread can be cut by a single blade at the wrong moment. But Bane had thought about this too. The single thread was also, precisely because it was single, invisible. The Jedi could not hunt what they could not find. And two people moving carefully through a galaxy of trillions, accumulating power in the shadows, rather than announcing themselves through large-scale military campaigns, were extraordinarily difficult to find. The Brotherhood of Darkness had failed in part because it was too large to hide. Two Sith, operating with absolute discretion, were effectively invisible. The Jedi looked for the Sith and found nothing, because the Sith they were looking for had always been too numerous to conceal, and Bane's Sith were not numerous. They were the opposite of numerous, and that invisibility was itself a form of power. An enemy cannot fight what they cannot perceive. For 1,000 years, it worked. The exact details of that millennium are mostly lost, because Bane had built his system around invisibility, and invisibility leaves few records. Zana succeeded him, completing the first transition and proving the system functioned. She trained her own apprentice. That apprentice trained theirs. The line extended, unbroken, through centuries of Sith master and Sith apprentice, each generation building on the last, each successor carrying everything that had come before and adding to it whatever their particular genius contributed. The Jedi Order believed, for that entire 1,000 years, that the Sith were extinct. They had watched the Brotherhood die at Ruusan. They had declared victory. They had restructured themselves for an era of peace. And somewhere in the galaxy, always just two, always invisible, always patient, the Sith were growing in exactly the way Bane had designed. The patience was itself a product of the design. Bane had understood that the Sith needed to stop thinking in terms of single generations. The Republic and the Jedi Order had been allowed to grow strong over millennia. They could not be defeated in a decade or a century by direct assault. They needed to be dismantled from within, gradually, over a time frame measured not in years, but in ages. This required a kind of sustained, disciplined patience that the dark side does not naturally produce. The dark side is urgent. It wants. It reaches. It does not easily accept the instruction to wait, to be still, to allow the moment that has not yet come to ripen without interference. Bane had to build the waiting into the system itself, make it structural rather than relying on individual restraint that would eventually fail. And he did. The rule of two made patience not a virtue to be maintained, but a logical consequence of the math. Two Sith cannot destroy a galactic republic and its 1,000-year-old Jedi Order by charging at it. Two Sith can only work through patience and manipulation and the slow corruption of the institutions they want to hollow out from the inside. The system required patience, and so patience became the defining characteristic of the Sith for 1,000 years. Darth Bane's ultimate legacy is not what you might first assume. It is not the Sith Empire that eventually rose. It is not the rule of two as a piece of abstract philosophy. It is something more specific and more devastating. He changed the nature of the Sith threat from something the galaxy could see and respond to into something the galaxy could not see at all. Every previous Sith Lord who shaped the galaxy had done so through visible force, armies, invasions, alliances, things that could be perceived and counted. Bane's Sith shaped the galaxy through invisibility, through the slow accumulation of influence in places no one was looking, through the patient corruption of institutions that believed themselves secure because the enemy they had always worried about had apparently disappeared. When the plan finally completed itself, when the Republic fell and the Jedi Order was slaughtered in the night, the galaxy was genuinely shocked. Not because the Sith had won, but because no one had known they were playing. That shock, that absolute failure of anticipation, that complete blindness to a threat that had been building for 1,000 years in plain sight, was Darth Bane's greatest achievement. He had not just planned a victory. He had made a victory so thoroughly invisible in its preparation that it arrived as something the galaxy had no category for, an ending that felt like a beginning, because no one had been watching the middle. There is a philosophical question about Darth Nihilus that is worth sitting with before anything else. The question is whether what he became still counts as a person. Not in a rhetorical sense, not as a way of dismissing or dehumanizing him, but as a genuine inquiry into what he was, because the answer shapes everything else about his story. He began as a person. That is certain. He was present at Malachor V during the catastrophic conclusion of the Mandalorian Wars, when a general named the Exile activated the mass shadow generator and destroyed the world and everyone on it, or almost everyone. The few beings who survived Malachor V survived in a specific way, which is to say, they survived by doing something to themselves with the force that was not survival in any complete or healthy sense. They survived by becoming something different from what they had been, by the trauma of feeling that many deaths at once, through the force which was open and connected and could not be shut down fast enough, and by the desperate unconscious response to that trauma, which was to reach for the dark side, not as a choice, but as a reflex, and to change. Nihilus changed more completely than any other survivor. The wound in the force that he became is one of the most genuinely alien concepts in all of Sith history. Not alien in the sense of coming from a foreign species or a distant culture. Alien in the sense of being fundamentally different from the category of thing it appears to be. He wore the shape of a person. He wore robes. He carried a lightsaber. He had an apprentice. He directed strategy. He made choices. The surface of him presented to any observer as a powerful and terrifying but recognizable Sith Lord. But what was underneath the surface was not a person in the way that term implies someone with needs and wants and a self that remains continuous across time. What Nihilus was underneath was hunger, pure, structureless, boundless hunger. The wound that had opened in him at Malachor V had never closed. The force flowed into it continuously and was never enough. He consumed force energy the way a person consumes food, except that no quantity of food could ever relieve the hunger, because the hunger was not a physical sensation indicating a biological need. It was what he was. He was not a person who was hungry. He was hunger, wearing a person's shape. This distinction matters for understanding what he was capable of. A hungry person attacks a food source because they need sustenance. Their attack is purposeful, directed, proportional to the goal of obtaining enough to satisfy the need. Nihilus was not like this. He did not attack force-sensitive targets because they were strategically valuable, or because eliminating them advanced some larger plan, or because he was angry at them, or because they had done something to him. He attacked them because he could not attack them. The presence of concentrated force energy, such as a gathering of Jedi, was to him not a political opportunity, but a feeding signal. The way a living thing responds to the presence of food is automatic, immediate, and not dependent on deliberation. He went where the force was concentrated because that was what he did. The same way water flows downhill. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is visible in what this meant for everyone around him. Entire worlds died. Not entire populations. Entire worlds. When Nihilus fed, he did not take the force energy from the specific individuals who wielded it and leave everyone else alone. He could not be that precise. The hunger was not precise. It consumed everything living in its radius, draining the life force from every organism, regardless of whether that organism had any special connection to the force. The Miraluka on Qatar were force-sensitive as a species, every one of them, which is why the Jedi, who gathered there for their secret conclave, chose it as a meeting place, reasoning that their own Force presence would be less distinguishable from the ambient. This reasoning turned out to be catastrophically wrong, because the concentration of Force users in a single location was exactly what drew Nihilus. And what he did when he arrived was not selective. The Jedi died. The Miraluka died. Every living thing on Qatar died, down to the smallest creatures that had never held a lightsaber or felt the Force in any conscious sense, because proximity to the hunger was all that was required to be consumed by it. Only one being survived, a young Miraluka woman named Visa Smar, who was somehow spared. The record of why she survived, whether it was accident or intention, or some quality in her that Nihilus recognized at a level beneath what could be called conscious decision-making, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he took her. She became his apprentice in a relationship that bore only superficial resemblance to the master-apprentice dynamic that structured other Sith relationships. He had no wisdom to transmit to her. He had no philosophy. He had hunger, and she was bound to him through Force, connection in a way that exposed her to the constant proximity of that hunger, which shaped her in ways she would only begin to understand when she finally turned against him. That he could have an apprentice at all, that the surface of him remained functional enough to maintain the appearance of direction and leadership, is one of the more unsettling facts about Darth Nihilus. Most beings that consumed other beings the way he consumed them did not also form political alliances and pursue strategic goals. He was part of the Sith triumvirate. He coordinated with Darth Traya and Darth Sion. He participated in something resembling a plan, the systematic elimination of the Jedi Order through the purge that the triumvirate directed in the years following the Jedi Civil War. The fact that his participation in this plan looked like choosing targets and dispatching fleets was remarkable given what he actually was. It suggests that the shell of the person he had been continued to function at some level, maintaining the external forms of purposeful action, even as the interior had become something that no longer had purposes in any recognizable sense. The Jedi purge that the triumvirate directed nearly succeeded in a way that no previous Sith effort had come close to. Previous Sith Lords had fought the Jedi in open battle and lost, or won battles without being able to exterminate the Order entirely before it could rebuild. The triumvirate's approach was different, slower, more complete. Rather than fighting the Jedi as a military organization, they hunted them as individuals, systematically, one by one, until there were so few left that the Order's structural continuity was genuinely in question. Nihilus was the most efficient instrument of this hunting, not because he was a skilled assassin or a brilliant strategist, but because his hunger, which could not be turned off and could not be negotiated with, made him a relentless and automatic eliminator of Force-sensitive life wherever he went. By the time the Jedi exile returned to Republic space, the Order that had stood for tens of thousands of years had been reduced to a handful of individuals in deep hiding, each of them operating alone, severed from the network that had defined Jedi life and practice. The Order had not been destroyed in a single great battle. It had been eaten slowly, thoroughly, leaving almost nothing behind. The defeat of Nihilus came through a specific and telling mechanism. The exile had her own wound in the Force, her own place of disconnection and void, that she had created unconsciously at Malachor V and carried since. When she faced him, she used this void not as a disadvantage but as a counter. His hunger reached for her and found nothing to hold on to. The technique by which he had consumed an entire planet, the great and terrible feeding that had defined him, was disrupted by an emptiness that mirrored his own in a way he had no response to. He fell. His mask, which was all that physically remained of whatever he had been before the wound took over everything else, was the only remnant left. What Darth Nihilus shaped in the galaxy's long history was not an empire or a philosophy or a political structure. He was not that kind of shaping force. What he shaped was the near total extinction of an order that had existed for 50,000 years. And while the Jedi survived, barely, through the efforts of the exile and the small number of people she had gathered around her, the order that emerged from the purge was permanently diminished. The deep wells of accumulated knowledge, the long lineages of masters and apprentices stretching back to the earliest days of Jedi history, the density of experience and tradition that an institution accumulates across 50 millennia, most of that was gone. The Jedi rebuilt, as they always rebuilt, with the resilience that defined them across all their many devastations. But they rebuilt from almost nothing. And the distance between what they had been before Nihilus and what they were after him was vast in ways that never fully closed. He did not intend any of this. Intention requires a self with purposes. He simply was what he was, and what he was consumed everything that the Force had saturated, which happened to include most of what the Jedi had spent 50,000 years building. The galaxy was shaped by him not because he chose to shape it, but because nothing capable of resisting what he was managed to get in the way before the damage was done. There is something worth sitting with in what that means. The most devastating blow the Jedi Order received in all its millennia of existence came not from a brilliant strategist who outsmarted them, not from a military genius who outmaneuvered them, not from a political schemer who corrupted them from within. It came from a being who was not making choices in any meaningful sense, who was not pursuing a goal, who was not, by any rigorous definition, an agent with intentions that could be reasoned with or anticipated or negotiated around. The Jedi had developed, across tens of thousands of years, every imaginable defensive posture against the kinds of threats that had intelligence behind them. They could counter armies. They could identify corruption. They could sense the dark side in someone who was using it against them. But what Nihilus was did not register on the instruments the Jedi had for detecting danger, not in the way that danger usually registers. He was not an attack. He was a force of nature, wearing a person's clothes. And the defenses built for attacks were not the right defenses for a force of nature. What the silence he left behind cost the galaxy is not fully calculable. The depth of the Jedi Order's accumulated wisdom, the breadth of the techniques and understandings that had developed across 50 millennia of practice, the specific approaches to the Force that individual lineages had developed and that lived only in the memories of the masters who carried them. Most of that was simply gone after the purge, not defeated, not refuted. Gone, in the way that things go when the people who carry them cease to exist. The most dangerous Sith Lord in this entire history was not the one with the most raw power. It was not the one who commanded the largest army or held the most territory or sat at the top of the most imposing hierarchy. It was the one who looked at everything the Sith had ever been and everything the Jedi had ever been and concluded that both of them were wrong, and not wrong in the trivial sense. Not wrong about tactics or strategy, or the best way to pursue their respective goals. Wrong at the foundational level. Wrong in the way that means the entire structure built on the foundation has to come down before anything true can be built in its place. Her name was Kreia. The Sith called her Darth Trier. The word Trier means betrayer. It is worth thinking about why that was the name given to her, and by whom. She betrayed the Jedi, who had made her a master and given her everything the Order had to offer, when she followed Revan into the dark side and to the Sith teachings that Revan had found on Malachor 5. She betrayed the Sith, who had made her a Dark Council member and given her power within the triumvirate she had helped to form, when Nihilus and Sion turned on her and cast her out because what she wanted was not what the Sith wanted, and they could see that with increasing clarity. She betrayed the exile, the student who had come to depend on her and trust her, when she revealed herself as Darth Trier and demonstrated that the patient guidance she had offered across an entire journey together had been, at least in part, a form of manipulation whose final destination the exile had not suspected. She betrayed everyone, eventually, and she knew this about herself. She named herself for it, or accepted the name that others gave her for it, which is the same thing. Because betrayal was not, in her understanding, a moral failure. It was the product of a particular and very precise way of seeing. She saw things as they were, not as people needed them to be. And when you see things as they are, cleanly and completely, without the softening that attachment and hope introduce into perception, you become the kind of person who does not hold back the truth on behalf of someone's comfort. You become the kind of person others call a betrayer, because you keep walking toward what is true, even when the people with you have stopped and are looking at something else. She had been a Jedi master of genuine and unusual capability, not primarily in combat. There were Jedi who were more physically formidable. Her gift was something harder to describe and much more valuable in the long run. She could see connections. She could perceive the web of causes and consequences that linked events together. The way one thing led to another led to something else, 3 steps removed that no one else had foreseen. She was, in the best sense of the word, a strategist. Not in the narrow military sense, but in the deep sense. The sense of being able to model how large systems evolve over time and identify the leverage points where small interventions produce enormous effects down the line. She took Revan as a student. Among all the students she had guided over a long career, Revan was the one she recognized as most fully matching her own capacity for this kind of deep pattern recognition. Revan could see the web the way she could. Revan could think across the temporal scales she thought across. And when Revan concluded that the Mandalorian threat required a response the Jedi Council was unwilling to provide and went to war without the Council's blessing, she understood why. She did not approve of everything that followed, but she understood. The distinction between understanding and approval is one that most people collapse into approval alone. She maintained it after Revan fell to the dark side, after Malachor 5 and the terrible gravity well of consequences that event set in motion. She found herself cast out of the order she had served, not for opposing the Council's decision, for being associated with Revan, for being the master of the one who had fallen furthest and fastest. The Jedi looked at the connection between teacher and student and drew the most convenient conclusion available, which was that the teacher must share some of the responsibility for the direction the student had gone. She was stripped of her connection to the Force and exiled. What happened to her afterward is one of the more genuinely dark transformations in a story full of dark transformations. being severed from the Force by people who knew her, who had worked beside her, who had eaten at the same table, and sought her counsel for decades, who then decided she was too contaminated by association to remain, did something to her understanding of the Force that no amount of further study could have accomplished. She had loved the Force. She had given her life to it in the specific way that Jedi Masters do, making the service of the Force the animating purpose of everything. And then the Force, through its chosen servants, had taken from her the one thing she most valued in the world. She had time to think about this. A great deal of time. And what she thought, in the silence where her Force connection had been, was something that no Jedi Master before her had thought with quite the same clarity and completeness. She thought that the Force was a problem, not a small problem. Not a problem that could be solved by better training or more enlightened philosophy or a more balanced understanding of its two aspects. A fundamental problem, an irreducible one. The Force bound all life together. Every living thing in the galaxy was part of it, and it was part of every living thing, which meant that every powerful Force user who arose, every Jedi Master or Sith Lord with the capacity to genuinely affect the course of history, was also affecting the Force itself, and the Force responded to these disturbances in its own way, according to its own balance and its own purposes, which were not necessarily the purposes of the living beings caught up in its tides. The Force consumed those it empowered. It shaped them for its own ends. It made weapons of them. And when the weapons had served their purpose, it broke them, the way you break a tool that has done its work. She had watched this pattern across an entire long life of studying and serving the Force. She had watched Jedi become instruments of its will and be spent. She had watched Sith become instruments of its dark current and be destroyed. She had watched the galaxy move through cycles of balance and imbalance, light and dark, stability and catastrophe. And she had asked herself the question that was available to anyone who looked long enough and honestly enough. Who does this serve? The answer she arrived at was that it served the Force, not the living, not the people caught in its currents. The Force found its own balance through them, yes, but finding balance is not the same thing as caring about the lives used in the process of finding it. She concluded that the Force needed to die, not its practitioners, the Force itself, the cosmic power, the binding energy, the thing that made Jedi and Sith and Force-sensitive beings what they were. If the Force could be removed from the galaxy's reality, if it could be cut away, then the living beings it had been using as instruments and weapons across tens of thousands of years would be free to grow without its interference, to make their own history, without the thumb of cosmic balance pressing down on every significant choice. This was a plan that required a specific kind of instrument. The exile was that instrument. The exile had created a wound in the Force at Malachor 5, a place of severance that disrupted the normal flow of Force energy in ways that most beings could not replicate. Kreia did not find the exile by accident. She found her because the exile's wound made her the most theoretically suitable vessel for what Kreia wanted to accomplish. Someone who existed in relationship to the Force in a fundamentally disrupted way, who formed connections through the Force differently from other users, who had already demonstrated the capacity to sever the connection that normal Force users treated as permanent and fundamental. If anyone could be guided toward a point where their interaction with the Force produced the wound at cosmic scale that Kreia envisioned, It was the exile. She guided her carefully. She taught her. She offered wisdom that was genuinely valuable. Because Kreia was genuinely wise and could not help offering real insight, even in the context of manipulation. She was not lying exactly, most of the time. When she counseled the exile, she was being truthful at every level except the one that mattered most, which was her actual intention for where the path they were walking together was supposed to end. The triumvirate she had helped to build was not built for the reason it appeared to be built. Nihilus and Sion and their systematic elimination of the Jedi was not, from Kreia's perspective, the point. It was preparation. The Jedi were Force-sensitive beings of great concentration and training. Their deaths produced specific effects in the Force. If enough of them died, the echoes of those deaths would ripple through the Force in ways that would create precisely the kind of disruption she was trying to engineer at the grand scale. She was not hunting the Jedi because she hated them or because they had wronged her, though they had. She was hunting them because their deaths were materials, ingredients in a project larger and stranger and more terrible than anything the Sith had attempted before her. When Nihilus and Sion turned on her, expelled her from the triumvirate she had built, it was because they sensed what she actually wanted and understood that it was not what they wanted. Nihilus wanted to feed. Sion wanted to hate. Both of those drives were served by the Purge, but neither of them was oriented toward the ultimate goal of ending the Force itself. They were Sith Lords of the traditional kind, in that their objectives were ultimately about themselves, about their own power and their own persistent survival and their own continued experience of what they were. Killing the Force would kill them too. More precisely, it would eliminate the thing they were made of, and that made them what they were. Of course they expelled her. Of course they tried to destroy her. She was planning to destroy the only thing they had. She survived. Barely. The expulsion from the triumvirate severed her from the dark side connection she had maintained. She was left with almost nothing, Force-wise, and found the exile at her lowest point, which was also the point at which the exile most needed guidance and was most likely to accept it from someone who offered it. What happened in the end was not what Kreia had planned. The exile confronted her at Malachor 5 after working through the triumvirate, defeating Nihilus and convincing Sion to let himself finally die. The confrontation between them was the most philosophically complex moment in this entire long history of Sith Lords and their legacies. Kreia was not wrong about everything she had observed. The Force did use its servants. The cycle of light and dark was genuinely relentless. The suffering it produced in the people caught up in it was real and constant and had been ongoing for tens of thousands of years without genuine resolution. Her diagnosis was not entirely inaccurate, but the exile chose a different interpretation. The Force's nature did not require its destruction. It required different engagement, a different understanding of what it meant to serve the Force without being consumed by it, a different relationship between the living and the cosmic energy that bound them. The exile had found something in her wound that Kreia had not found in hers. Not peace with the Force, but a kind of clarity about the distinction between what the Force was and what was done with it. The Force did not choose the violence done in its name. The living beings who wielded it chose. And if they chose differently, the Force moved differently. They fought. Kreia lost. But she did not lose in the way that Sith Lords usually lose. She lost and kept talking, which is the most telling thing about her. Even in defeat, even dying, she continued to teach. She gave prophecies. She described futures that the exile would face. She spoke about Revan and about what waited in the unknown regions, and about the nature of the wound in the Force and what it would eventually mean. She did not stop being a teacher in the moment of her death. The teaching was so deep in her that even the ending of her life did not interrupt it. What Darth Traya shaped in the galaxy is the hardest to quantify of anything in this history. Naga Sadow opened doors. Freedon Nad built a culture that lasted centuries. Exar Kun burned bright and left dark places in the Force that waited for millennia. Darth Bane redesigned the Sith at their foundation and set them on the path that eventually destroyed the Republic. Darth Nihilus consumed the Jedi Order until almost nothing remained. Kreia asked the question that no one else in this entire long history had asked. Not the question of how to defeat the Jedi or how to rule the galaxy or how to live forever. The question of whether the Force itself was the problem. And she asked it with enough intelligence and enough precision and enough willingness to follow the answer wherever it led, that she came closer than anyone before or after her to answering it on her own terms. She failed. But failing at the most fundamental question anyone has ever thought to ask is a different kind of failure from the ones that surround it. It is, in its way, a more interesting failure, a more illuminating one. The exile went on from Malachor V, carrying everything Kreia had taught her, including the parts Kreia had not meant as teaching, but that turned out to be the most important lessons of all. What you learn from someone who intends to use you is not always what they intended to teach. Sometimes the most honest things about a person are visible precisely in the places where they are being most deliberate about concealing them. The galaxy that exists at the end of all of this is not a simple place. It is not the result of a simple history. It did not become what it became through the action of grand impersonal forces or the inevitable logic of historical momentum. It became what it became because specific people, in specific moments, made specific choices. And some of those choices sent consequences forward through time so far and so deep that the people living inside those consequences thousands of years later had no way of knowing what they were living in the shadow of. Naga Sadow broke a sealed border and set knowledge moving through the galaxy that had been contained. That knowledge traveled. It found people who were looking for it. It built temples and libraries and traditions. It seduced Jedi who were searching for something the Order could not give them. It produced empires and wars and extinctions and close calls that shaped the Republic and the Jedi Order in permanent ways, making them harder in some places and more brittle in others, preparing them without their knowledge for the challenges that were coming. Freedon Nad took what Sadow had left and refined it. He built a tradition out of it that persisted for centuries beyond his death. He demonstrated that the dark side could be embedded so deeply in a culture that it continued to operate long after its source was gone, the way a current continues after the thing that set it in motion has stopped. He showed that the most durable form of power is the kind that lives inside the minds of the people it governs, so thoroughly internalized that they cannot identify it as power from outside. They think it is simply the world. Exar Kun burned. He burned brilliantly and terribly, and left marks on the Jedi Order that would not fully heal, left a presence on Yavin 4 that would wait through the ages for the next person whose particular combination of pain and potential made them a suitable vessel, left an understanding of how quickly and completely the Order could be corrupted from within. that should have been taken more seriously by every generation that came after him, and mostly was not. Darth Bane redesigned the entire nature of the Sith threat, and in doing so, made it invisible. The galaxy spent 1,000 years not defending against the thing that was going to destroy it. Because the thing that was going to destroy it did not look like a threat. It looked like absence, like a problem that had been solved. And when the absence revealed itself as presence, as the most enormous and complete presence the Sith had ever assembled, the galaxy had no prepared response. It had spent 1,000 years not preparing. That unpreparedness was Bane's greatest work. Darth Nihilus consumed. He consumed the accumulated depth of an order that had been building for 50,000 years. The Jedi survived. They always survived. But the version of the order that existed after him was a thinner thing than what had existed before. And thin things, when the next great challenge comes, are tested more severely than things with depth. Darth Trier asked. She asked the question that sat under everything else, the question about whether the Force itself was a problem. And she did not ask it timidly or academically. She asked it with her whole intelligence and her whole will and her whole remaining power. She asked it and built a plan around the answer she had arrived at, and pursued that plan with the ruthlessness of someone who believed they had found the truth. She was wrong, or at least the exile believed she was wrong and defeated her on that basis. But wrong pursued with that much clarity and that much intelligence produces the kind of disruption that shapes everything it touches. It unsettles the foundations. It forces engagement with questions that settled institutions would prefer to leave unasked. The Jedi Order, in the aftermath of the exile's journey, was never quite as certain as it had been before Kreia examined it. Some of the questions she had asked, even in the context of manipulation and destruction, had been real questions. And real questions, once asked clearly enough, do not simply disappear because the person who asked them has been defeated. They persist. They work on the minds of the people who heard them. They resurface generations later in the mouths of people who never knew Kreia existed, because the questions belong to the inquiry itself and not to the one who first articulated them clearly enough to demand a response. Every one of them mattered, not because they succeeded. Most of them failed, in the narrow sense of failing to achieve the specific thing they most wanted. Sado did not conquer the Republic. Nad did not build an eternal dark side kingdom. Kun did not destroy the Jedi permanently. Bane's lineage produced the final reckoning he designed, but he was not there to see it. Nihilus did not sate his hunger, because his hunger could not be sated. Trier did not kill the Force, but the galaxy they all moved through was not the same galaxy it had been before they arrived in it. Each of them left something, sometimes something terrible, sometimes something that had its own kind of terrible beauty, in the way that anything pursued with total conviction has a kind of beauty even when what is being pursued is destruction. Sometimes something that nobody at the time understood, that only became clear generations later, when the consequences of a single choice arrived. At the moment they had been traveling toward all along. The dark side does not build. That is the common understanding. It corrupts and consumes and unmakes. The Sith are the agents of entropy, of the consuming darkness, of the Force that tears down what the light constructs. And this understanding is not wrong, but it is not complete either. Because entropy is not nothing, tearing down is not nothing. The spaces created by the things that have been consumed do not stay empty. Something always grows in them. Something always moves into the absence and becomes the next thing. The galaxy that the Sith Lords tore at, generation after generation, for thousands of years, was continuously remade by the tearing, not into what the Sith wanted, usually, not into what anyone had planned, but into something, always into something. And that something was the galaxy that the next generation inherited and lived in and was shaped by. The beings who lived through these ages and survived them were not unchanged. They were made harder or more afraid or more determined or more aware of specific vulnerabilities or more careful about specific kinds of trust. They were changed by what the dark side lords put them through in the same way that everything is changed by the forces that act on it. The galaxy's long exposure to the Sith did not simply damage it. It also educated it, in the painful way that the most permanent education always happens, through experience that cannot be undone, and that leaves marks that inform every subsequent decision. The institutions that survived the Sith are not the same institutions they were before the Sith. The Republic that the dark side lords kept tearing at and breaking and rebuilding itself against was, at each stage of its recovery, slightly different from what it had been before. Not always stronger in the obvious ways, sometimes more rigid in the places where flexibility would have served it better, because the previous crisis had revealed a specific vulnerability there, and the response to that vulnerability was to harden it. Sometimes weaker in places that had previously been sturdy, because the crisis had passed through those places and left structural damage that repair covered without fully addressing. Institutions are like people in this respect. What they go through changes them, and they carry those changes forward, whether they are aware of carrying them or not. The Jedi Order is the clearest example of this. The order that stood at the end of the Old Republic was not the order that had existed at the dawn of the Great Hyperspace War. Thousands of years of engagement with the Sith, of loss and near extinction and slow rebuilding, of internal corruption and external assault, and the long accumulated weight of watching the dark side find, generation after generation, new forms and new vessels and new approaches, had shaped the order in ways that were legible if you knew how to read them. The excessive caution around emotional attachment, the wariness about training students who showed the specific combination of power and instability that had historically produced dark side falls, the emphasis on detachment from outcomes as a spiritual practice, which was in part a response to the way Sith Lords had historically exploited Jedi attachment to produce exactly the crises the Jedi most feared. These were not arbitrary rules. They were lessons written in the specific language of catastrophe, encoded into doctrine so that future generations would not have to learn the same lessons at the same cost. The tragedy is that encoded lessons are not the same as understood ones. A doctrine that exists because of something that happened is not the same as a living understanding of why that thing happened and what the actual principle is that it teaches. Over time, the encoded doctrine persists while the living understanding of its origin fades. And when the specific situation arises for which the doctrine was never actually adequate, because the doctrine was designed for the specific situation that created it, and not for all the situations that share its underlying structure, the order follows the doctrine and discovers, too late, that the doctrine was a memory of a lesson rather than the lesson itself. The Sith knew this. Not all of them consciously, but the pattern is visible in how the most successful Sith Lords operated. They did not attack the Jedi Order at its strongest points. They attacked at the places where the encoded lessons had calcified into something that no longer responded to the actual situation. The places where the Order's memory of past danger had become a blind spot to present danger in a new form. Whether those marks were worth what they cost is not a question with an answer that stays still. Ask it in one generation, and the cost seems too enormous, the price too high, the damage too irreversible. Ask it several generations later, and you find people who are wiser about the dark side than their ancestors were, more careful about the specific forms of seduction that Sith Lords have historically used, more attentive to the patterns that precede the worst catastrophes. Because those patterns were taught to them by the catastrophes themselves. The student who learns by surviving the storm understands the storm in a way the student who only read about it does not. The galaxy was the student. The Sith Lords were the storm, and the understanding that accumulated across all those centuries of being in the storm, imperfect and incomplete and always arriving slightly too late to be fully useful, was still understanding. It was still something. It still mattered in the end, even when the end was barely survivable. The Sith Lords shaped the galaxy, and the galaxy, in being shaped by them, learned how to recognize the shape. Not always in time, not always completely, but incrementally, across the slow turning of the ages. Something like understanding accumulated alongside the suffering. The dark side is patient. It has always been patient. It does not require visible victories to continue. It does not need to win every confrontation. It needs only to persist, to find the next vessel, the next opportunity, the next person whose combination of gifts and pain and desire makes them a natural resonant point for what is always waiting just beneath the surface of everything. It has that patience built into its nature in a way that the light side does not, because the light side is oriented toward the present, toward the living, toward the immediate needs of the beings caught up in its care. The dark side can afford to think in centuries, because it does not care about the beings it uses in the way they care about themselves. It cares about its own continuation, and its own continuation is the one thing it has never failed to secure. And perhaps that patience is the only adequate response to something that patient is a patience of your own. A commitment to understanding not just the individual actors, but the pattern they all participate in, the tide they are all expressions of. Not because understanding the pattern makes you immune to it, but because nothing else comes close. Close enough, sometimes, is all there is. And it has always been enough. So far. Just barely. Just. The light has always found a way. May the Force be with you.